Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Ezekiel.
So it's been a while since I worked through the book of Ezekiel, and I have an opening observation after having gone through it carefully in anticipation of our conversation here. And that is, wow! Let me try it again. Dang! Let me try it one more time. What the heck? It's so intense. I forgot how much the book of Ezekiel is characterized by this sustained look at God's anger at a level and for an amount of time, screen time, that I don't think we see anywhere else in the Bible. This is God unloading on what's left of his chosen people as they are about to be taken away into captivity and utterly defeated and ruined by the Babylonians. And then even more piling on happens after they get taken away into captivity. But like everything else we've seen where God's wrath and judgment comes out, there is also hope and there's also a promise of redemption. But the mechanics of that work a little bit differently here. Back to my original point, though. The intensity here is massive, so much so that I felt as I read this kind of like I feel when my friends who have kids start scolding their kids and getting after them. And like I had nothing to do with what their 4-year-old just did wrong, getting their fruit roll-up hands all over somebody's glass or whatever. Like, whatever. Maybe the kid needed to be corrected or scolded. Maybe they're breaking rules. But when they start yelling at their kid, I'm like, I feel guilty. I feel bad. I feel awkward. I feel like I've done something wrong by proxy. And that is how I feel going through this. I'm not from Israel. I was born 2,500, 2,600 years after the events described here. I got problems, but it's kind of a different list of problems than what they have. But there is so much judgment from God as I listen to him scold his children, his chosen people, that I can't help but hunch my shoulders as I read it. I think that's probably the best way to read it. I think it's good to get worn down by the tone of Ezekiel and get to a place where you're like, all right, well, yeah, I'm not perfect either. And I suppose if there was a book like this about the things that I got wrong, I wouldn't really like it if everybody got to read that for a few thousand years after the fact. So I'm just going to take this correction by proxy as well and try to see what I'm supposed to take from this book. So that begs the question, what are we supposed to take from Ezekiel and what's really going on here? And further, how do we sift through all of this given the very bizarre imagery that we get throughout the book of Ezekiel? So I'm going to do my best to break this thing down. First of all, let's talk about the guy who wrote it. And it's pretty clear that this has a ton of autobiographical details. And actually, unlike many of the prophets of the Old Testament, where we have a sense of when they're writing, with Ezekiel, because of the time markers he gives us historically, we can say like, oh, it was probably like April 11th of this year. He was sitting there writing this thing. Maybe not quite that precise, but really close. We have a clear timeline on when Ezekiel is writing all of this stuff down. And that's helpful because then we can compare it with what was going on politically in these other parts of the ancient world who are being prophesied about. So Ezekiel is a dude who we meet in Babylon, not in Israel. He's a very young man, and in the opening scene of the book of Ezekiel, he is sitting on the banks of the rivers, thinking about life, and probably feeling pretty sad about the fact that he is an exile, but he's a member of a group of early exiles that you and I haven't talked about very much in our conversation here. But at the end of 2 Kings, at the end of 2 Chronicles, when the conquest happens of the southern kingdom and Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes in and conquers everybody and destroys the temple and takes them away into captivity in Babylon, that actually happened in 2 waves. And the first waves happened very early in the 6th century, probably 597 BC, when a bunch of cultural elites and significant characters, but a small minority of residents of Jerusalem, got taken away into captivity along with their young king. It was kind of a shot across the bow from Nebuchadnezzar to be like, get your act together, or there's going to be a lot more where this came from. Well, poor Ezekiel gets swept up in that relocation program of Nebuchadnezzar. So again, the book of Ezekiel opens. Ezekiel's sitting there on the banks of a river somewhere in Babylon. And who should show up but God? I'm not kidding. Not like through the words of a prophet. No, straight up the glory of God shows up in a way that we've sort of seen already in the Bible, but in a way that's also kind of new and more. Ezekiel sees this heavenly chariot, this heavenly litter, if you know, a litter, that's like the thing that the servants carry around on their shoulders back in the ancient world, and then people would ride in there and get fanned and fed grapes and stuff like that. It looks like that's what Ezekiel's describing, except the four corners of this litter that God is riding on are being carried by angels who do not look like the adorable depictions of precious moments figurines. They look weird and terrifying. And they got a bunch of eyes and wings and weird heads, and they're all like hovering over wheels. So it looks like something out of science fiction and deep cut fantasy imagery, and understandably, Ezekiel doesn't know what to do with it, but he knows God when he's looking at God, and the glory of God is there. And again, I told you the imagery is odd. He ends up eating a scroll of the words of the wisdom of the truth of God and being commissioned under the title Son of Man to go and say and do things that God wants to communicate to a whole slew of different people. And so Ezekiel, what choice does he have? He goes and does that. So what we've got now is Jeremiah, who we've talked about a lot over the last couple of days. He's clear back in Jerusalem. He didn't get taken with the first wave of exiles, but he predicted that was all coming way in advance. And then you'll recall in the book of Jeremiah, he sees that horrible catastrophe, that horrible calamity befall Jerusalem, and everybody get taken away. So Jeremiah is over there hearing from God as well, at the same time that God is also in Babylon, where Ezekiel is hearing from God. The message seems to be more or less the same, in that God is very unhappy and that this is a right and just judgment against their behavior, and nobody can argue that God is being just and doing exactly what he said he would do by judging his own people. So Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, we're all on the same page. God is just to bring about this judgment, even if it is horrible. But Jeremiah is trying to prepare the people who aren't yet in exile to go and do what they're supposed to do and play the role they're supposed to play while in exile, which is still coming. Meanwhile, Ezekiel is being commissioned to talk to, presumably, primarily, the people who are in exile with him, these early exiles before the big batch of exiles gets hauled away by Nebuchadnezzar a few years later in 586 BC. But weirdly, in the meantime, God tells Ezekiel to do like weird acts of public protest. And honestly, I don't know what to make of this or how to feel about it emotionally, because it looks like some of the really ridiculous, theatrical, over-the-top kind of protests that we see going on even today as I'm recording this all around the world over various issues. But God commands Ezekiel to go do performance art. And the performance art is bizarre. He's supposed to make little props and like puppets and act out scenes of what's going to happen. And he's supposed to do this thing where he goes and lays down in public for this massively long period of time, all bound up as like a symbol of what's going to happen to the rest of God's chosen people. And he has to eat food over a fire of burning poop. And I think I'm getting this detail right. I think at first God's deal is like, it's going to be human poop. And then Ezekiel's like, what if it was like animal poop? And God is like, okay, we'll go with animal poop. But the worst thing about all of this performative prophecy that Ezekiel has to act out is that God makes it really clear, like none of it's going to work at all. I'm just basically what God is doing is he's setting up his case to be like, let no one say that my name is sullied by the way this went down. I sent notice, I sent more notice, I sent prophets, I communicated what I was doing, and you all ignored all of it. That's very central to the message of Ezekiel, which then pivots to imagery throughout the book that effectively is saying God's not in the temple anymore. The Spirit of God is going to leave that temple, and it's not going to be dwelling among the people in that place anymore, which is obviously calamitous. It's catastrophic. What does this mean for the redemptive plan? But then about the time that you're trying to let that stuff sink in, we just get smashed with tens of chapters of God reeling off condemnation for his own people, for neighboring people groups about all the stuff they got wrong. And the punchline of each of these judgments and each of these calamities that God is predicting through his mouthpiece Ezekiel is that when it's all done, then they will know that I am God. They will know that I am the Lord. I listen to this audible version of the Bible, and I read it in the text as well. But the audible version I'm doing is a British actor named David Suchet. He played Hercule Poirot and other legendary characters. He's got a fantastic voice, and his reading throughout the Bible has this very chill God voice. And whenever it is God, he is right up on the microphone and speaks like this, and it's chilling. Even when God is happy, it invokes reverence. This guy did an amazing job on his reading of the Bible. But in this one, his angry God voice and his "then they will know that I am the Lord" is just, it's intense. And again, you feel that vicarious correction, even though it's addressed to Tyre or Egypt or whomever. It feels like he is talking to you. And in fairness, I felt the same way just reading it with my eyes as well. But in the midst of all of this, there is this little nugget, this little hint about how God is going to create a new heart out of this hardened heart of his people. And it kind of sounds like the famous verse in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians 5:17, "Therefore, if anyone's in Christ, he's a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come." And so it's at that point, at about the 25% mark in this book, that we start being like, okay, there's a lot of judgment happening here, but it almost feels like we're getting a new paradigm that's being rolled out. Like there's a new deal being vaguely anticipated and hinted at between God and maybe not even just his chosen people, maybe between God and people, period. Because these judgments, as we go through the rest of Ezekiel, are different than the other stuff we've seen in other books. This feels final. Like, you blew it. This is my judgment. You are dead, straight up dead. But then, as bad as that sounds, as we get into the second half of the book, almost in keeping with the way Abraham negotiated with God a little bit for Lot and for Sodom and Gomorrah, the way Moses seemed to negotiate with God a little bit, like, God, for the sake of your own name, don't leave us all out into the desert to die. You got to deliver us into this land. What will the nations think? And we kind of see that same line of thinking here as God spells it out very clearly in chapter 36 that he is still going to bring about redemption. There is still going to be a Messiah. All of the things he said he was going to do, he's still going to do. But he makes it clear that he's not going to do it for the sake of Israel because they somehow earned it or held up their end of the bargain. He's going to do it for the sake of his own name. And to illustrate how God is going to take that absolutely dead, broken, stone heart of his people and make it alive again in a way that is new for his glory, he takes Ezekiel out to this valley where everybody's dead. There's a bunch of bones laying around, like in the Lion King where the hyenas are or something. And then God brings the bones back to life and they reassemble back together, and flesh comes upon them, and all of a sudden there's a new people, a living, thriving people, where there was only dust and death and absolutely total hopelessness. There was nothing those dead, rickety bones were going to do to put themselves back together. But God decides there will be life here. There will be a people where there were not a people, lest we would worry that they would suffer the same fate that they suffered last time around. Like, oh, you'll just get trampled on by the evil of other nations and your own hearts will turn to stone. No, no, no. We get a reiteration from God that he's going to create a new heart in people that is soft and that is different and that somehow is a part of a new relationship from this life-giving temple that will pour out its waters that flow out of this temple that it's not even clear if this is an actual literal temple or what, but this water will flow out into the desert and bring life to this dry, dead land. And it's almost like we're talking about a return to Eden. And we learn that it's a return to Eden that is unassailable because this evil evil kingly character and his 7-nation army, that's where that reference comes from, by the way, they come against God, but God crushes them 3 different ways. And it's like, no, the evil forces are not going to prevail against this new family, this new people that I am making, and their own hard hearts are not going to prevail against them. God is going to redeem, fending off evil from within and without, and there's going to be some kind of new relationship between God and his people that looks like the one that used to exist in the garden, but that got wrecked. Ezekiel then seems really intimidating when you read through it the first time, because that judgment language stands out so starkly. But upon closer review, what we actually see here is not a glimmer of hope. We see a mountain of hope. We see a whole new pathway, a roadmap forward for how this seemingly broken plan is actually alive and well, and how God's sovereignty over this redemptive plan has never even been remotely threatened by the bad behavior of his chosen people, but for the sake of his glory, he's going to see it through, and now we have a clearer picture of exactly what that's going to look like. When you visualize Ezekiel, there's a lot of things you could picture, but let's just have you picture that valley of dry bones and people coming back to life with new, soft hearts. When you think about the central theme, think about the fact that God has decided he is still going to redeem, not for the sake of his rebellious people, but for the sake of his own name. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, go check out chapter 36. I know it took a little more time to get through the book of Ezekiel here, but it's a hugely important, underappreciated pivot point between all of the problems being set up in the Old Testament and moving toward anticipating the solutions that we see in Jesus in the New Testament. So thanks for gaming it out with me. Congratulations to both of us on leveling up our collective Ezekiel game. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.